It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by emailrevealer.com. Go to emailrevealer.com and we can check out the online infidelity investigation. You can give us your spouse's, your boyfriend's email address. We can trace it to online dating websites. Also, check out oppermanreport.com. Go to oppermanreport.com, and we have a lot of exclusive content. We have a lot of shows on there that you won't find live on Friday night or Saturday night. Exclusive content. And also, we're uploading a lot of exclusive documents, court documents and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, we got some from our guest here today, Montgomery Blair Sibley. Okay, now this is the story of Deborah Palfrey, the D.C. madam. This is her attorney, and this is the man who has the list. He's got in his possession the phone bill, the Verizon phone records of the D.C. madam. Mr. Sibley, are you there?
Yes, sir, Ed. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you again. Thank you again for coming on the show. Now, who is Montgomery Blair Sibley? Tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm almost 60 years old. I practiced law since 1981. Grew up in New York, upstate New York, Rochester. Went to law school and went to work at the district attorney's office, where I was a prosecutor for 5 years. After that, I went into private practice. I migrated to Miami, Florida. And in the early 2000s, started representing escort agencies who had their assets seized by government agencies up and down the eastern seaboard.
Okay, now that's interesting. Now, did you become involved with Ms. Palfrey before she was arrested or after she was arrested?
Well, it was before she was arrested because there were two stages in her prosecution by the federal government. I had actually written her, as I did everybody who's had their assets seized in a certain way by the government, and said, I'm representing escort agencies on the East Coast, and it would be helpful to my clients and to you if I could speak to your attorney about your case, because if we share information, it would benefit both our clients. And that's when I first reached out to her individually, and she responded that she did not have an attorney at that point, and that's when I became involved with her in October of 2006.
Okay, but when you became in contact with her, she was already under some kind of police involvement, or this was before?
No, that's a good question, and I need to just back up a second and explain how it works with the federal government. Often they will go into court and get an order to seize somebody's assets, claiming those assets are the fruits of a criminal enterprise. And that's what happened in Jeane's case. In October of 2006, the government, having completed an investigation that lasted well over a year, got a judge in California to order the seizure of Jeane's house, all her bank accounts, and the contents of the house. And that's the warrant of arrest in rem, it's called technically, that they executed on her house in mid-October 2006.
Very interesting. So the federal government conducts their own investigation, goes to a judge, and gets an order that they're allowed to seize your assets without a trial, before a trial.
Exactly right. And it's a very strange procedure. It's called forfeiture, in this case civil forfeiture, and later criminal forfeiture. But it's an instance in American law when you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent.
And this became your specialty in some way. Now, how did you first get involved in that?
Well, living in Miami as I did in the 90s, that was a huge drug capital of the world, as most people know, and obviously along with that goes the money laundering. And so the government was seizing $1 million in cash a week at the Miami airport and seizing over $300 million a year in assets like real estate, businesses, cars, planes, boats. So it was a very busy forfeiture market in which I was practicing and became quite an expert in that area of the law at the time.
Okay, now that makes perfect sense. Okay. So now you get in touch with Ms. Palfrey. What was your first impression?
Well, like most clients, she was mystified, terrified, didn't know what was going on, thought it was very unfair, and so we spent a fair amount of time just educating her on what was going on and what the course of the prosecution of her was going to look like.
And how did you respond to the government in order to protect her assets?
Well, initially she came to Washington, D.C. Remember, she lived out in Vallejo, California, and her escort agency was operating out of the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area. So she came to D.C. to meet with me, and we outlined our initial response, which was to challenge the seizure of the property, and that's when these phone records surfaced for the first time.
Now, were you successful in preventing the seizure of her property?
No, the property had already been seized. Now, understand that they seized the property first, then there's an adjudication, which can include a jury trial, and ultimately the government proves that you're guilty, you have to prove you're innocent, and the chips fall where they may at the end of that proceeding. So we were just at the beginning phases of that civil forfeiture proceeding when she and I first were in contact.
Okay, but ultimately, were you ever successful in reversing that civil forfeiture proceeding?
No, because Jeane insisted, and I would just call her Jeane Palfrey. Her full name was Deborah Jeane Palfrey. But Jeane insisted that we fight vigorously against the civil forfeiture, and having done that, the government turned around and then indicted her criminally for running a racketeering influence corrupt organization known as RICO, and money laundering and operating a prostitution enterprise. Did
you warn her against that? Did you think that might have happened?
Well, we absolutely did. It's a typical tactic of the government. They seize your assets, and if you fight them, then they turn around and indict you, so you lose not only your property, you lose your liberty as well.
First they take your money, then when you complain, they arrest you.
Exactly right, and she was very feisty and wasn't going to give up without a fight. And knowing the consequences, she was willing to go forward, and in fact did. And that began a 2-year prosecution, or I should say about a 1.5-year prosecution of her that ultimately resulted in her being found dead on May 1st, 2008.
Right, but before we get to that, now 2006, how old was she in 2006?
52 years old.
52 years old. Now, was she married or?
No, I mean, I'll give you a brief background on her.
Yeah.
She went to high school in Pennsylvania, migrated out to San Diego, started law school out there, took a cocktail waitressing job to support herself. Ultimately, the law school did not pan out. The cocktail waitressing job turned into a prostitution job. She was very bright and began to organize the prostitutes into an escort agency out in San Diego. About 1.5 years into that activity in 1992, she was arrested, pled guilty, and after some rigmarole, ultimately spent about 1.5 years in California State Prison for her role in that San Diego prostitution escort service.
Oh, so she had been arrested previously in 92.
Correct. And upon being released, she had nobody in her life, and she immediately set up a new escort service, this time in Washington, D.C., and after about 6 months on the ground here in Washington, D.C., she relocated back to California and ran the escort service from there, remotely, quite frankly, just by telephone interviews and mail.
Now, what made her pick D.C.? Do you know?
Well, organized crime controls most of the escort services on the eastern seaboard, except the District of Columbia is an island of non-organized crime activity because we have 32 different police forces in the metropolitan D.C. area, and it just is not an attractive place to try to run organized crime. So it sort of was a unclaimed area for escort services at the time.
And I suppose the organized crime wouldn't want to compete with the greatest organized criminals of the federal government.
And I'll neither confirm or deny the truth of that statement, but I tend to hear what you're saying.
Yeah, come on, the biggest gang in town. Okay.
Really?
I know. Well, this is just fascinating. I'm learning so much already, brand new stuff that I did not know. Okay. Now, so she starts this operation in D.C. Now, was it immediately successful, or did she have some kind of an angel or a godfather come in there and help her out?
No. She ran this whole thing on her own starting in 1994, and it quickly ramped up to a very successful operation with between 20 and 30 escorts working for her. And, she was a very bright woman, very highly organized, would have been a master's of business administration candidate easily if she'd wanted to devote her time to that. And very quickly, from 1994 until October of 2006, she was doing very, very well and had amassed savings of about $4 million from the profit from her activity during her work during that time.
Now, when you hear about some of these other escort stories there in D.C., like I had Henry Vinson on the show, there's an element of blackmail going on in the background. Was she ever involved in anything like that?
To my knowledge, she was not involved in blackmail because she never knew who her customers were. She never met them. All she had was a telephone number, and that was the end of it. I mean, she knew who her escorts were because she vetted them very carefully, required them to fill out applications and provide driver's licenses and all that. But she never had the means to blackmail any clients because she didn't know who they were. And from what I understood from talking to the escorts and Jeane, they never had any interest in, never engaged in that sort of behavior as well.
Okay, gotcha. So now she has the problem with they're trying to seize her assets. Now they charge her criminally. Were you part of the criminal defense? I'm sure you were.
Well, let me just back up a little bit and explain how that trajectory occurred. What happened was when the Keystone Cop police raided Jeane's house in October of 2006, they seized all the assets they could find related to the prostitution service, her computer, a lot of the files she kept on the escorts, various notebooks she had, and left untouched by these police were 2 cookie jars that had about $50,000 in Cougarans and boxes in the basement for them that said telephone records, Pamela Martin and Associates, 1994 through 2006. Just as an aside, the name of her escort service was called Pamela Martin and Associates in the District of Columbia area. So once I got in contact with Jeane and learned of the existence of the telephone records, I immediately had her UPS those to me in my office here in Washington, D.C. The reason being, I assumed sooner or later the police would come back for them, and I wanted to make sure I had them and the government didn't. So when we went in to negotiate the settlement of the... Go ahead.
No, I'm listening.
Okay, so when we went in to negotiate the settlement of the civil forfeiture charge, and Jeane was willing to give up some money, maybe $1 million of the $4 million they had seized, I said, look, if this goes forward, I have the telephone numbers and will be able to identify the clients of this escort service for the last 14, 13 years in the District of Columbia. And as a result, you're going to cause a lot of pain and suffering for something that actually is not even a crime in the District of Columbia, because prostitution was illegal in the District of Columbia until late 2006. The response of the government was no, and we're going to indict her, and they did. So, yes, the criminal charges came out in the February of 2007, and I represented her on those charges almost up until the trial of the matter in April of 2008.
Now, was it common in your practice back at that time to be able to negotiate like that and say, listen, okay, you want $4 million, we'll give you $1 million, everybody goes their own way?
And that's a great question, and that's the odd thing. Understand, I've done literally hundreds of forfeiture cases, dozens of them related to escort agencies, and the end result is the government just wants a big chunk of cash and lets everybody walk away, particularly in the escort side, because they're not there to make anybody unhappy. They're just shaking people down in a legal way, if you will. So the fact that they were so unreasonable and then turned around and indicted her rather than just litigate out the civil forfeiture charges was anomalous. It was unusual in my experience in that world.
Okay, now that's interesting. Now, why do you think that is? Do you think it was because it was D.C., or do you think it was because you were in possession of those phone records?
I think the original motivation for this prosecution was purely political. And understand, this prosecution originated out of Baltimore when they began tracking express mail envelopes to one P.O. box in California, and that was Jeane's escorts going to the post offices, buying money orders for Jeane's share of any appointment the escort had, and then putting the money order in an express mail envelope and sending it to Jeane's P.O. box. The large number of express mail envelopes going to one P.O. box triggered a U.S. Postal Service computer tracking software and alerted an investigator from the post office that there was money laundering going on, because that was a typical money laundering profile behavior. That resulted in the backtracking of who owned the post office box in California, that being Jeane, and who was buying these money orders, that being the escorts in the Metro D.C. area. So all that matured into January of 2006 with a full report from the post office saying to the Attorney General in Baltimore, the U.S. Attorney in Baltimore, prosecute this case. In February of 2006, the U.S. Attorney in Baltimore said, nah, it's not worth it. I'm not going to do it. And that was the end of the matter. But then all of a sudden in October in 2006, the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia picks up the case and runs with it anew, and that's where the whole case started. So I think there were deep political motivations for this case going forward. Regrettably, I only can speculate because we were not allowed to get the information that would have answered that question dispositively.
What information were you looking for?
Well, I believed that Jeane's service was being used for national security reasons. That is, they were monitoring her escorts, monitoring the people. It's called a honeypot in spy parlance. And if the escorts themselves didn't know about it or Jeane didn't know about it, they were being watched with who they were having these affairs or assignations with. Also, remember October 2006, the Republicans were in a panic about losing the House, and they may have been looking for dirt on Democratic candidates they could have embarrassed. And that was another reason for this rather odd prosecution and raiding of her house, et cetera, that went all wrong when they forgot to take the phone records, and I got hold of them.
Okay. Now, it seems to me that when you discuss how they were tipped off by purchasing these money orders and then sending them all this express mail to the same P.O. box, I'm assuming that they were buying these money orders like in the amount of like $9,000. Was it something along that line?
No, sir, because Jeane charged about $350 for a 1-hour date with an escort. Okay. And of that $350, Jeane got $150. An escort would have typically 4 or 5 appointments a week, and so they'd be sending Jeane between $500 and $800 at the end of every week by an express mail envelope. So it wasn't the money being large. It was the fact that there were a large number of envelopes going to one P.O. box in Vallejo, California from the D.C. metro area.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. And then then you say that you believe there was an intelligence operation, that they were spying on her and spying on the escorts and spying on the clients. But if that's the case, then why wouldn't they, rather than arrest her, just say, hey, Jeane, come on in, we want to talk to you, you're going to work for us from now on?
Well, you imagine, Ed, that this is a monolithic government, but it's not. It's more like an octopus with tentacles. So it's not necessarily clear that one tentacle understands or agrees or isn't actually in a battle with another tentacle around here. And when you have a White House at that time highly politicized by Karl Rove and trickling down into a Department of Justice, which prosecuted 6 times more Democrats for government waste and fraud than Republicans, you have an entirely different kind of landscape for where this kind of political prosecution can go forward. Now, understand there were some very sympathetic responses from the intelligence community as this went forward, but again, those were shot down in due course.
Oh, how did they raise their head? How did that come up?
Well, understand that al-Awlaki was a terrorist, a Muslim terrorist, who met with the bombers who flew into the World Trade Centers on 9/11. And he was a frequent user of Jeane's escort service. And so after every assignation, the FBI agents who were trailing al-Awlaki around the D.C. metropolitan area would meet with the escorts and debrief them on his behaviors and gather information to ultimately humiliate and, reveal what kind of a hypocrite he was, to be preaching this holy Islamic Quran code, but then practicing just the opposite behavior in his private life. So when we began subpoenaing the records from the National Security Agency, Department, the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and half a dozen more agencies, most of them, candidly, most people have never even heard of around here, we were getting feedback that they were welcoming the subpoenas because they'd be able to tell us things that would help Jeane's case.
Okay, now I wasn't aware of anything about this Al-Awlaki guy. Now the girls who were visiting him, then they start getting picked up by the FBI. They want to talk with these agents, whatever. Now, were they reporting that back to Jeane or no?
That's what Jeane told me, that she understood that sometimes they would be talking to agents after the fact.
Okay.
But that's why she was left alone for 13 years. Remember, not one time in 13 years, and with over 10,000 dates during that period, was there ever an arrest or any sort of criminal prosecution of her or her women at any time. So they were left almost intentionally alone to operate here, certainly with the full knowledge of the government for a large period of time.
And in your experience, you haven't found that to be unusual, right? Usually these escort services, they're also involved in tipping off the cops.
In other cities that I've been involved with, it there is a fair amount of scratching each other's back and other things going on between the escorts and the police agencies.
And a lot of blackmail, too. Have you noticed that, too, in other cases besides this one?
Well, I got to tell you, there is a continuum of prostitution enterprises, from the unfortunately cracked out streetwalker up to various levels of organized crime to the very high end, which consider it a profession and treat it as such, with ethical standards that are higher than doctors or lawyers, as far as I've seen in my experience. So on that continuum, yes, there can be some sleazy behavior, but for Jeane's escort service, she only recruited and employed really very intelligent, usually college-educated women, and those women were in it for whatever reasons, for periods of 4 to 8 months typically, and then would cycle out and new women would cycle in. So, no, I never saw the blackmail from Jeane's perspective or the women she worked for her.
Okay. Now, you got your hands, I heard these phone records described at 40 pounds of phone records. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It took a handcart to bring them into my office when they arrived with the UPS driver. And, whenever you had a phone, you get a phone bill at the end of the month, and because Jeane was in California, it was a long-distance call every time a client or an escort called her. As a result, the phone number that was calling her showed up on the bill, and this was particularly true after 2000, when people started using cell phones rather than calling from their hotel rooms or private residences or businesses to set up the dates with Jeane's escorts.
So now, that's a huge undertaking to process all these phone bills. How did you handle that?
Well, we didn't have any resources. Right. Obviously, the government had huge resources, but they didn't have the phone records. So initially, I partnered with ABC News, investigative journalist reporter named Brian Ross, and made a deal with him. I would give him 2,000 phone numbers in exchange for him sharing with us the identities of the people he identified from those phone numbers, because he had the resources to reverse look up phone numbers that we just didn't have, because basically it was just Jeane, myself, and my 9-year-old son working at that point in time.
Well, okay, that was very enterprising of you there. You hook up with ABC News, you tell them, okay, we'll give you 2,000 at a time. They're going to break the numbers for you and come back. Now, did you find anything juicy in there?
Well, the answer is, did ABC News find anything juicy?
They weren't sharing it back with you?
Well, this is what happened.
Okay.
They found a lot of information. Particularly, ultimately, we learned Senator David Vitter, who was a U.S. Senator at the time, Harlan Ullman, who was a shock and awe person for the Department of Defense. He designed that shock and awe battlefield plan for them. And then Randall Tobias, who was head of the U.S. AID, which is one of the largest economic aid internationally organizations in Washington, and as everyone knows, is a front for most of the CIA activities that come out of Washington, and dozens of others. But when it came time for Brian Ross to air his report, Something happened, we don't know, but ultimately the 20-minute report on ABC News ended in hardly anyone actually being identified, and Brian ultimately would not tell us who he found, and that created something of a panic because now we had invested and got no return with Brian Ross and ABC News.
Yeah, I could imagine. Now, this USAID guy, right, that you said it was the front for the CIA, how often did his number appear in there? Was this a frequent flyer?
Yeah, and he liked to have more than one escort at a time at his little parties, which he later insisted he was only getting massages for.
Okay.
But it was multiple occasions, as well as with Senator David Vitter and Randall Harlan Ullman as well.
Okay. So and then you couldn't process the rest yourself. You just couldn't do it.
We couldn't do it because we just didn't have the skills. So one thing I should mention at this point, Ed, is we did identify that a U.S. attorney in Washington was a customer of the service. Now, this created a kind of interesting situation because we could allege, and in fact I wrote Alberto Gonzalez, who was the Attorney General at the time, and said, look, you can't prosecute us if someone from your office was a frequent client of the escort service, because that's a conflict of interest. I want an independent prosecutor. You have 72 hours or I'm releasing all the phone records into the public domain. This was March of 2007. The result was the government immediately went into court and got what is now the infamous March 22nd restraining order, telling me personally I was not to release those phone records into the public domain. And of course, besides the 2000 that ABC News had, for a period of time, I did not release those records.
You know something? Now that I think about this, why the hell can't you release these records? What is in this restraining order? Because I can release my records if I want. I have plenty of records here, my own phone bills and my own electric bill. If I want to release it, I can release it. Why not? What's their reason?
It's a good question. And the answer is that the government told the judge, and again, this was a hearing that we weren't even aware of. It was called an ex parte hearing, that, look, Mr. Sibley is going to call these people up and harass them and scare them into not testifying against Jeane at trial. He's going to harass our witnesses, intimidate our witnesses, and therefore he has to be restrained. So as a result, that was why the order was issued in March of 2007.
That is mind-blowing.
Yeah, they were in a panic. They sort of caught a tiger by the tail, thought Jeane would roll over in October of 2006. And when she didn't, I guess they didn't see any way out except to go forward, but they didn't realize what I had and what I would do with it in due course.
Now, let me ask you a question, because then this is obviously today this has turned you into like a pit bull, like were you always this aggressive and
Yes. I mean, it's just the way I litigate. I don't take prisoners, and I don't practice law on my knees.
Yeah, because this is she got the right guy. I tell you that, man. Okay, so ultimately, though, they got this crazy, unbelievable restraining order, and I'm sure you challenged that many, many times, correct?
Well, we did, and what most people don't realize is come June of 2007, the restraining order is technically partially vacated. And I'm now allowed to release the phone numbers, but not the names and addresses of the clients and escorts for Pamela Martin and Associates Escort Service. And so I, by this time, had scanned the entire 10,000 pages of phone records, if you will, and I may have misstated the number. I think it was like 3,000 pages of phone numbers. In any event, we had scanned it all in and put it on a PDF, and I created 50 copies of CDs with the phone records in raw data form and distributed them widely to people of interest, journalists and gawkers, I suppose, in June and July of 2007. The result was a bunch of students up at Brandeis University in Boston made the phone records into a searchable database. So if you put in your cell phone number, Ed,
right,
if it was in the records, the date, time of the call from that cell phone would then pop up. And we had lots of people putting in their husband's cell phone numbers and coming up with their husband's cell phones. And I got a lot of calls from some very angry husbands and some wives and Lord knows what else. But ultimately, the numbers became public. But here was the problem. There are no white pages for cell phone numbers. That is, if you have a cell phone number, I assume you do, I can't look it up and find it easily. Now, you're an investigator. You may have some resources that certainly we didn't have in 2006, but
Right.
there's no simple way to identify the owner of the cell phone number on a particular date and time. And so while the vast majority of numbers that we identified prior to the year 2000 went to hotels and businesses and private homes, they were all landlines, and they were in the white pages or in public records of some sort. After 2000, most people were using cell phones and using their cell phones to call Jeane's escort service. So now we had a wall after 2000 of not being able to identify who these individuals were because we couldn't connect the cell phone number with a particular person. For example, this Harlan Ullman called from his house, so we were very easy able to identify his number and that it was him because we could find his number in the public records. Senator David Vitter's cell phone number was public knowledge, and so we were able to track back and find his number because we were able to identify the number that way.
This searchable database you described before that these students made, is that still available?
No. The Brandois boys took it down at Jeane's request shortly before the trial in April of 2008.
Okay. Now, have you done any work on this? Yeah, I know you have because we saw some stuff you released recently. So let's stick with to the time frame. So now, how did this? You went to trial. How did that go? Was it stacked right away? Obviously.
Well, for a lot of reasons. In October of 2007, I go to the court. Judge Gladys Kessler, who's in charge of Jeane's criminal case, and I said, ex parte, again, without telling the government I was there, Judge Kessler, I want to issue subpoenas to establish the defense that Jeane was acting for the U.S. government, and to do that, I need to subpoena the intelligence agencies, the police departments, and the White House, because that's where I knew the loci of the political prosecution came from. And Judge Kessler said, absolutely, you are entitled to that, and I will order those subpoenas to be issued. I will order the U.S. Marshal Service to deliver those subpoenas, and you will get the information to answer your questions so that you can raise a legitimate criminal defense of this trial. Those subpoenas in due course are beginning to be served shortly before Thanksgiving on 2007, and the community in D.C. goes nuts. They don't realize what to do. I've also subpoenaed at the same time every cell phone company, giving them a list of 6,000 telephone numbers, asking them to tell me who on those telephone numbers list are customers of theirs and what those customers' names and addresses are. So up to Thanksgiving 2007, these about 25 different subpoenas are being served all over D.C. Things are going crazy, and on one morning, I think it was the 26th or 27th of November 2007, Judge Kessler is removed from the case, and a new judge named Judge Robertson is brought in on the case. Judge Robertson is a FISA judge, and that is shorthand for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court judge. This is the court that approves the secret wiretapping subpoenas which Ed Snowden revealed to the world in the CIA's and the NSA's Project Prism, where they basically collected the phone calls of everyone in the United States for a 5 or 6 year period. This was a secret judge, and he immediately was put in place of Judge Kessler, who was very sympathetic to us. And then at a rather infamous hearing in December of 2007, immediately quashed all my subpoenas and told the agencies that they didn't have to respond to my subpoenas. And remarkably, in open court, he said to me, and I'm almost quoting verbatim, Mr. Sibley, I've been getting a lot of phone calls about your subpoenas, and I'm quashing all of them. And at this point, the U.S. attorney jumped up and said, does that include Mr. Sibley's subpoena of the White House? I want to be clear. And the judge said, yes, I'm quashing the subpoena, Mr. Sibley's subpoena of the White House. So all of a sudden, everything that Judge Kessler had agreed to and understood, Judge Robertson came in without even asking me, without giving me a chance to be heard, and undid it all to stop those subpoenas from going forward.
What reason did he give for quashing the subpoenas?
That's not only an interesting question, it has an interesting answer.
That's why I got you on the show, man.
He did not give a reason except to say that he'd been getting a lot of phone calls, which was totally improper. You're not supposed to call a judge privately and ask him to do something. You walk into open court and say, I have a reason, Judge, for you to quash him with a subpoena. And you can even do that in a sealed proceeding, but you don't just call the judge. And more importantly, the order he issued quashing the judge does not appear to this day in the docket or the records of the case against Jeane Palfrey.
Okay, well, if it's not in the, I was just going to say, well, if it's not in the record, then you can go and proceed with the subpoenas. But no, you can't because the case is over, right?
That's correct. There's no legal reason to be issuing subpoenas for this information at this point in time.
Is that the first time you've ever seen an order disappear from litigation?
Yes, it is. That's the first time. It's just insane to me. Yeah, it's insane.
Okay, we got to take a commercial break. We are here with Montgomery Blair Sibley, who's turning into my new hero. Okay, I'm very impressed with this whole story. There's a lot more here that I did not know about. Montgomery Blair Sibley. There's a website called whyjusther.com, and that's where you can get a hold of Mr. Sibley's book, Why Just Her, which is about Jeane Palfrey. We'll be right back after these messages with more of Montgomery Blair Sibley. Thank you so much. This is your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. And if you're enjoying this show right now, there's more. You can get more. You can go to the Ed Opperman YouTube channel, and you could subscribe there. And we have archives of all of our past shows for over the past 3 years, about 200, 300 shows. You can also go to the Opperman Report Spreaker channel, and you could follow us there. Again, a ton of shows, about 300 shows on there. And whenever we do an impromptu show, an emergency-type broadcast that we do during the week occasionally, you'll get an email notifying you of breaking news and spontaneous broadcasts that we may do during the week. You can also go to oppermanreport.com and become a member. If you become a member, you help support the free archives on Spreaker and YouTube, and you help support the free shows on Friday evening and on Saturday evening. Each of these shows, Friday evening and Saturday evening, are carried for free on 7 internet stations, okay? So you help support that, but also, too, at OppermanReport.com in the members section, we have exclusive content. Shows that are recorded during the week that are only available to members. So please check out OppermanReport.com and help support the show.
The son of a Polish immigrant who grew up in a Brooklyn tenement, Bernie Sanders. He went to public schools, then college, where the work of his life began, fighting injustice and inequality, speaking truth to power. Bernie moved to Vermont, won election and praise as one of America's best mayors. In Congress, Bernie stood up for working families and for principle, opposing the Iraq War, supporting veterans. Now he's taking on Wall Street and a corrupt political system that holds up a rigged economy. Bernie's campaign is funded by over 1 million small contributions from people like you. He's fighting for living wages, equal pay, and tuition-free public colleges. Bernie Sanders.
People are sick and tired of establishment politics, and they want real change.
Bernie Sanders, husband, father, grandfather, an honest leader, building a movement with you to give us a future to believe in.
I'm Bernie Sanders, candidate for president, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Bernie 2016.
Check out strawmanmusic.com. Sean Duff is our webmaster here at the Opperman Report, and he's a very talented musician. He's part of a band called Strawman. They're based up there in Canada. Don't hold that against them. These are like-minded folks. If you like the shows you hear on the Opperman Report, you'll like the music that they have over at strawmanmusic.com.
Enough is enough. Wall Street's greed and illegal behavior drove this country into the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. And then, after getting a huge taxpayer bailout because they were too big to fail, it turns out that 3 out of the 4 largest banks are bigger today than they were before we bailed them out. That's crazy. I'm Bernie Sanders. My plan: break up the big banks who are strangling our economy and make them pay their fair share of taxes. Then we can invest in the middle class, expand Social Security, and provide universal college education. I'll rein in Wall Street behavior so they can't crash our economy again. Will they like me? No. Will they begin to play by the rules if I'm president? You better believe it. I'm Bernie Sanders, Democratic candidate for president, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Bernie 2016.
You know, you can get a copy of my book, How to Succeed as a Private Investigator, if you go to my website, emailrevealer.com. Now, this is a limited edition book, okay? And you can get a signed copy of this book, and it'll be personally autographed to you or whoever you want to give the book to as a gift. Once you have my signature on that book, you can copy the signature and put it on checks and pass them all over the world. Emailrevealer.com. Get a copy of my book, How to Succeed as a Private Investigator.
He's fought injustice and inequality his whole life. Bernie Sanders. As a college student, he was arrested for challenging segregated housing. Bernie marched with Dr. King and thousands of others for civil rights. In Congress, Bernie stood up for working families on health care and jobs. Now he's taking on Wall Street banks and a corrupt political system that keeps in place a rigged economy. Bernie Sanders, a reformer who believes in ending racial profiling and mass incarceration so the justice system works for everyone. Bernie Sanders.
There is no president who will fight harder to end institutional racism and reform our broken criminal justice system.
Bernie Sanders, an honest leader building a movement with you to give us a future to believe in.
I'm Bernie Sanders, candidate for president, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Bernie 2016.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. We're here with Montgomery Blair Sibley. He's the author of the book, Why Just Her? This is about the D.C. Madam, and the website for the book is whyjusther.com. Mr. Sibley, we left off that the FISA judge comes in. By the way, what was the reason for them bringing in this new judge?
Nobody knows. It was unprecedented to yank one judge off a case she had been involved in for over a year and understood the nuances, and there was a lot of complicated stuff going on, to bring in somebody cold who had no idea. And it's not like Judge Kessler would left the bench or was ill, because she has, to this day, continues to sit on the D.C. District Court. So it was unprecedented just to pull the case from her.
Okay, so this FISA judge says, okay, I'm quashing all your subpoenas. I'm not going to tell you why. I'm getting phone calls. So I guess at this point now, what was your defense? Did you have to change your defense, or what was the plan now?
Well, something peculiar happened on that day, and I do have to alert you to.
Okay.
Verizon Wireless had gotten my subpoena a couple days before the hearing, before Judge Robertson, and in their very efficient way, after a little prodding from me, they sent me a disc, and the CD on it had the answer to my subpoena, and in fact, it contained 815 account records of individuals whose phone numbers appeared in and among the 6,000 I had sent them by subpoena. Obviously, Sprint, AT&T, all those other wireless carriers, their subpoenas were quashed, but Verizon's got through before Judge Robertson quashed all the other subpoenas.
Very interesting. So now you have them, but you still can't use them in court.
Well, no, that's an interesting question. Now, yes, we could use them in court, but about this time, for reasons that were never entirely clear, Jeane decided to go with a different attorney to represent her in the criminal trial. And that's a long, drawn-out story, but the long and short of it was she felt and was told by people that I was being too aggressive and I would hurt her chances at trial. She needed a more traditional attorney, and as such, she replaced me with another attorney here in D.C. who would ultimately try the criminal case and not call a single witness to the stand, including those that we knew about and now the ones we knew from the Verizon wireless subpoena return.
Can you be sympathetic, though, with her choice of saying, okay, my God, this is way too big for me. This guy is a pit bull. This guy's a super pit bull. And people are probably telling her, hey, listen, someone can finesse this and kind of negotiate something. Can you be sympathetic with her decision to do that?
I'm not sure sympathetic's the word I would use. I mean, obviously, it wasn't a rash decision. In fact, Judge Robertson himself called us privately into his chambers to discuss it. And the end result was, I believe Jeane was manipulated during a fragile time to take a more conservative approach to the one that I was going to be pursuing on her behalf. And all I could do as her attorney was respect her choice, because it's not my job to tell a client what to do. I can only give them the options to make sure they're making an informed decision. She was compos mentis at the time, and as a result, President Burton became her attorney for the criminal proceedings in April of 2008.
Well, obviously you're more familiar with the facts than I am. So now, ultimately she was convicted. What did she get?
In April 14th, I think, of 2008, the jury came back after a very short period out and found her guilty of all charges. Judge Robertson adjourned the case for 6 weeks, which is the normal course in these kind of cases, in order for a pre-sentence report to be prepared, which is required, and set sentencing for, I believe, early June of 2008, and Jeane was released on bail during that period of time.
And that's when she was found hung in a shed.
Yes, just to be a little bit more clear on the timeline, we had a very aggressive appeal plan. I was brought back in by Jeane to actually do the appeal, and we were very optimistic that we had planted so many error judgments in the case that we would have a very strong case on appeal to get the whole thing overturned. There were prosecutorial misconduct allegations regarding the discovery, regarding contact with witnesses, behaviors, the whole 9 yards. And Jeane was very upbeat about all that. Ultimately, she went to her condominium that she had, the government never knew about, in Orlando, and then a couple of days after that went to see her mother, who lived in a trailer park in Florida. And on, as I said, May 1st, 2008, her mother found her in the morning hanging from a rope in her tool shed in the back of her trailer park lot.
And what is your opinion on that? What do you think? You think this could have been a suicide, or you think it's definitely was a murder?
Ed, that's a question I've asked myself, and I've been asked many times, and I don't have a 100% answer that I can live with. There are too many things that make it look very unusual for Jeane to have done this, and there are elements of this death that make it very likely it was a suicide. So regrettably, it's one of those questions in life that you're never going to get an answer to. I don't know.
Okay. Now, they started coming after you too now, right?
Well, now the case was over. There was some winding up of the civil forfeiture case. I was still her attorney on the civil forfeiture case, and she expected and wanted me to go forward. The government convicted her. They didn't convict her assets, and now we have to have a separate civil proceeding in front of another jury to actually try the allegations against her assets, if you will. Then a lot of things happen very quickly. Jeane has died. Her mother is then supplanted as the representative of her estate. My law license is now automatically, or I should say not automatically, my law license is suspended by the state of Florida for allegations that occurred 8 years earlier, and immediately the district court in District of Columbia suspends my license to practice, taking me out of the civil forfeiture case, because in the civil forfeiture case I have a lot more discovery options than I do in a criminal case where I have to ask permission for discovery. In a civil case, you get whatever you want, basically. So all that happens very quickly, and the case is wound up. Jeane's mother gets a check for about $300,000, if I remember, and the government keeps the balance of the estate, and the whole thing is put to rest. Okay.
So, and then what year was that?
That was in the summer of 2008.
2008. Now, from 2008 until today, have you done anything else with this?
I was suspended from the practice of law,
right.
And actually I kind of welcomed it as a vacation and took the next year to write the book, which we've talked about briefly, because I wanted to memorialize everything that went on, because I knew as I get older I'd forget. It was so much, and it is quite a thick book. It's more of an encyclopedia than a book, I suspect. But then I put it to bed. Life moved on for me. I had a son I was raising and other things going on in my life, and I didn't really think about this case anymore after the book was done until January of 2016, when I was preparing to teach a privacy course at a college up here in Northern Virginia, and decided it would be interesting for the students to see not only the privacy statutes that were involved in this and other cases I had, but how the actual mechanisms of protecting those privacy rights move forward. And that's when I opened the box that I'd been hauling around of this case for the last 7 or 8 years and started going through those records. And that's what triggered sort of my aha moment when the light bulb went off over my head.
So you were going through these phone records by hand, and you spotted something that involves the presidential election of 2016.
No, I actually, the Verizon records are in a database on an Excel spreadsheet. And I had opened up that spreadsheet just as I had forgotten what was going on during all that period of time and started looking at the names, the numbers, and the agencies that were ultimately identified by Verizon Wireless as customers or escorts of the service. And that's when I realized that with the looming presidential and the Senate and the House is up for re-election in November as well, the information I had is something I thought many people would deem relevant to their decision-making process. And as a result, I felt not only the right, but indeed the obligation under the First Amendment to expose this information for the public's consideration.
So let me be clear. You're not specifically saying that the information that disturbed you was presidential election. It also could have been the House or the Senate.
It was all three.
All three.
It involves issues in the operation of our government that I believe need to be addressed not only by representatives and senators, but by the presidential candidates themselves. So
you went back to the court and explain. You went back to the court and asked that the restraining order be lifted, correct?
And yeah, I did. And here was the confusion for me.
Okay.
I knew there was some sort of restraining order because it was ambiguous as to what was permitted and not permitted. I understood there were orders that never showed up in the court records, and I didn't want to find myself at the end of a knock on the door from the U.S. Marshal Service with a warrant for my arrest for criminal contempt of court. So as a prudent individual, I went to the court, in this case now another judge named Judge Roberts, and I said to Judge Roberts, I have this information. I think it's relevant. I have a First Amendment right to speak, yet I recognize the court has the authority to limit my speech in certain situations. Please tell me what I can and cannot do. Judge Richard Roberts, refused and ordered the clerk to file my pleading. He wasn't going to even let me file the request, and instead issued an order saying you shouldn't even have these records. I presume you shouldn't have these records, but in all events, I'm not even going to file your request, and therefore forget about it. So I politely went back and filed a second pleading saying, Judge, you're wrong. I do have the right to these records, but more importantly, I have the right to have my request at least filed and ruled upon so I can take it up on appeal if you disagree with me. He again made a motion, issued an order directing the clerk not to file my pleading. And that's when the cow backed into the fan and we have disaster, of course.
Well, how is that? Because ultimately there is an exhibit that has these phone numbers on them.
Correct.
How did that come about? You're a brilliant lawyer. I got to tell you. I wish I had.
No. There's an Excel spreadsheet I got from Verizon.
Right.
I have it.
Right.
I didn't file that. I just said, Judge, this is what I have. I have a right to speak, and I'd like the clarification on how that right has been, if at all, limited by the court's order. And he wouldn't answer the question because he closed the courthouse doors to me, to put it in simple terms. So I then went to his boss, the Circuit Court of Appeal, and said, you have to order the clerk to file my pleading so that the judge can rule on it. They ultimately refused to do that. And in the interim, I made a special application to the Supreme Court asking them to intervene as a matter of discretion. And they said, no, we're not going to intervene. Just to give you the procedural battleground, so ultimately about a month ago, the appellate court said we're not going to order anything, and I've gone back to them one last time and said you can't do that. I expect them to say yes, we can, and then I'll be procedurally postured to go back to the Supreme Court, and this time they're going to have a lot harder time ignoring me because I'll be filing pleading that they really have to address.
So you're going to continue filing?
Right. There's still a procedural vehicle that I have to exhaust, Ed, because before I release these records publicly, I want to establish the defense that if I'm charged with releasing them by violating a court order, I exhausted every possible mechanism for seeking relief of that order. And if I do that and they won't even let me file the pleading, I don't think they can enforce an order. I don't think any jury in the country is going to convict me of contempt of court for an order that I wasn't allowed to seek clarification on.
And do you suspect that if you were to release these documents, that they are going to go back to a 2007 restraining order and charge you on that? That would be unusual, don't you think?
If you'd like to take my place in jail, I'd be happy to roll.
No, that's it. But my question is, though, my question, I'll take the top bunk, okay. But my question is, that would be unusual, though, for a normal client to be concerned about a 2007 restraining order, right? No?
An order of the court, Ed, is an order of the court. You trespass upon it at your peril. Okay. Whether it's 10 years old, 20 years old, or 30 years old, it's an order. And, I'm an officer of the court. I respect and honor the rule of law, and I'm approaching it the way it should be approached, to say, hey, the order needs to be clarified or changed or vacated or not. There may be compelling national security interest reasons for continuing to muzzle me because I have something that should not be made public for whatever good reason there is. But I have a right as a U.S. citizen to go into court to ask the question. And right now, the district court, the appellate court, the Supreme Court are closing their doors, prohibiting me from even walking in and laying the pleading before the court.
Now, there is an exhibit, though, in your pleadings that has a list of businesses that were contacting your client, former client, Ms. Palfrey. Now, one of them was the Archdiocese of D.C., am I correct?
The Archdiocese called called Jeane on more than one occasion.
Do we have any idea why?
Well, there's only two reasons you would have dialed Jeane's number. But one is because you misdialed it by mistake, in which the call should be a very short duration, 30 seconds. I'm sorry, I got the wrong number. The other reason is you were trying to organize a date with one of her escorts, and then we see a pattern in the phone records where there's a phone call. It usually lasted 3 to 5 minutes. It would end. Jeane would then make a call to one of her escorts, so that's the next call from her phone number is going out to one of the escorts. Then there's a second call from Jeane back to, in let's say this case, the Archdiocese, the same number, saying we've confirmed so-and-so to appear at such and such address at such and such a time. And then about an hour or 3 hours later, we get a call from that same escort, and that's when Jeane always insisted they called when they arrived and they called when they left, because she wanted to keep her escort safe. And so then there'll be two calls about an hour apart from the escort. And that pattern belies someone claimed that they dialed the wrong number, because they wouldn't dial the wrong number twice, within minutes of each other, the way it shows up on the records. Now, in this exhibit that you created, does that pattern exist? If I were to look at this exhibit right now, would I be able to see that pattern of the Archdiocese calling and then her calling the escort then? Or has that been filtered? You would see that pattern, but not in the exhibit. Ed, just to be clear, you'd have to go back to the phone records and pull up the day of that call to see the pattern of call, return call, escort call, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I understand. Now, there's some other, there's some major defense contractors and law firms, and there's quite an interesting list on there. Well, there are 187 different agencies, companies, private enterprises listed, because as I closely read the order, I was not prohibited from listing the names of the companies, just the actual individuals. So that's why I took the rather bold step of listing the companies to let the court know that there was significant issues here that I should have the right to be heard and decided. Now, I haven't looked at that exhibit lately, but is there anything on there that you think you would want to draw our attention to that says, hey, take a look at this? I think the totality of the list is really stunning for what it says about what goes on within the Beltway here, and how there seems to be two sets of laws in this country, one for most of us schmucks out there, and then the other privileged few who have a set of laws that says you can do whatever you damn please, and there are no legal consequences for your behavior. No, or on the other hand, a guy like you who says, hey, I'm standing up for my rights, and then a big boulder comes crashing down on you. Now, well, and that's the one they don't want to let me in open court, because remember, once I walk into open court and there's a judge sitting there, and the stenographer is taking down everything we say, and I think, modestly, there'll be a phalanx of journalists and reporters coming to court with me. I get to say things that now no one can hide from because the judge has to sit there, hear them, and he's going to have to address them. He cannot hide. And like our legislatures hide from big questions all the time, once you're in front of a judge in open court, he's got a problem. Because when you ask him a question about something he did, he can't go running off the bench or he just answered your question.
Gotcha. Now, is there another court date coming up?
There is no court date scheduled. I have another lawsuit pending against the judge and the clerk for refusing to file my pleadings. The judge in that case has refused to even address my emergency motion, which has been pending for over a month. And so I'm just waiting. In the fullness of time, the Circuit Court of Appeal will rule, and I should be at the Supreme Court with what's called a petition for writ of certiorari by the first week in June. And then that will trigger some interesting behavior across the court spectrum, I believe.
Okay. Now, in this story, in this interview, is there anything I've forgotten to ask you that you think that's important to get out?
Well, I just wish people could hear me say a simple statement, which is, if you want to sleep as a citizen, you deserve whatever you get. But every 4 years, we have a chance to force our public officials to address and answer questions of pressing concerns. And I think this is the time to do this. We shouldn't be talking about how big people's hands are. We should be talking about significant issues that affect the direction this country is taking. And I think we're in a critical time in this country's lifeblood.
I agree with you on that 100%. Montgomery,
I know you do.
Thank you. Montgomery Blair Sibley. Now, listen, you got to promise me, anything comes up, 24 hours a day, give me a call. I'll put you right on the air, okay? Don't worry, wake me up.
I've done very few interviews because most of the journalists I run across, Ed, simply want a soundbite, something titillating. And this isn't about titillation. This is about illumination. And that's why you giving me the time to explain this in the detail, which I think people need to understand, is something I highly value. And, again, I thank you for that opportunity.
No, thank you, too. And also, too, we have a section on the website where I'm going to upload these last two motions that you filed, okay? I'm going to upload those on there. So anything you want to send me that you think is important that you want up on there, just send it to me, please.
I will do so, Ed.
Montgomery Blair Sibley, thank you so much. Author of the book, Why Just Her, and you can get that at whyjusther.com. Sir, thank you so much, okay? Keep in touch.
We will. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.